Hi, everyone. We have so far been talking about the consolidation, and we also use the reference of the business combinations, and the word control was something that we had not talked in detail. Right? It's time for us to now look at what exactly is the word control all about. Right? We said that a parent is an entity which controls the subsidiary, and a subsidiary is an entity which is controlled by the parent. So of course the entire focus that goes on is to understand the word control itself. Okay, let's try to establish, let's try to understand this, in a broader framework, something that we already know. Okay, we have understood a parent or a subsidiary in general, right? A parent is an entity that has more than 50% stake in the other entity, so called as a subsidiary. Okay. So, what does this more than 50% signify? What does this more than 50% suggest? Okay. Think about it like this: any decision making about this company, right, the subsidiary, it would be done by two sets of people to start the discussion. We say it would either be the board of directors or the shareholders. Okay. But then we again start asking ourselves that eventually the board is also nominated by the shareholders, right? Should I be, or can I become a director in a company? My shareholder, the company's shareholders have to approve that part first, right? So eventually the shareholders are the ones who decide. And in a common phrase, in a common frame, you see that somebody who has a majority stake should be able to also take a decision about, for example, the subsidiary, at the annual general meetings or extraordinary general meetings, in all these forums where the shareholders are present, or at a board meeting, for example, where the representations from the shareholders are present. That is where the decision making are taking place, and the majority shall strive. And that's the reason why we understood it rightly. There's nothing wrong in assuming, and we of course talked in the previous section also, that if there is a more than 50% shareholding in another entity, control is assumed, right? Because the decision making, because the power to direct the policies of the business are etc are all done at that point in time at the meeting, for example, right? So it would be okay to assume that more than 50% means the control exists, right? But then we start looking at this perspective. The moment you have the majority shareholding and presuming control, right? The moment we hear this word control, we are saying, please consolidate, right? The moment you heard this term control, you start doing the consolidation, right? And the moment you consolidate, all those eliminations would start to come, right? You were happily showing a revenue, you were happily showing a profit, but the moment you come at a group level, because you control the other entity, it's all eliminated. It becomes clean out of the system, which again brings the performance back to where it originally was, right? So what people may think, that if it is a majority stake, thereby the control, and I have to consolidate, right? What if I do not have a majority stake? Okay. Does it mean there would not be a control and eventually no need to consolidate? Could it mean like that? Well, probably yes. But then we need to establish that part. Right? We need to understand that part because there is a likelihood, there is a possibility that even with a less than majority stake, control may be present, right? So again, we haven't discussed, we haven't explained that as yet. What is the meaning of control? But we'll be taking still some time to address that part. The one aspect that you want to remember that even with less than a majority stake, there can be a control, which means that even if you don't have more than 50% shareholding, you may have a control, and accordingly, you will consolidate because you are presumably the parent or the acquirer of that other company. Okay, let's try to understand this in a more practical perspective in terms of what exactly happens in real life, right? How do people manage to showcase that they control even with less than majority shareholding? Okay, say for example, there is a company XY, okay, and let's say there are three shareholders: company A, company B, and company C. Okay. Say for the sake of argument, this company has 45% shares in XY. This company has 35% shares in XY. And of course, the balance amount, 20%, is owned by company C. Okay. Now, none of these companies, neither A nor B nor C, has more than 50% shares. That's not present, which probably suggests that nobody is a parent, right? But then that's a shareholding, that's the legal structure, that's a legal form. We need to talk about the substance of the arrangement. We need to look at the substance, or the what is the real intent of having these shares in this company. Okay, say for example, okay, company A has all the expertise, right? It has all the expertise to operate the business of XY, right? It has all the expertise, it has all the infrastructure, it has all the resources available that it can very comfortably manage the operations of XY, and it has been able to do that very successfully in the past. Okay. Company B and company C in this scenario, for example, are simply agreeing to what is proposed by company A. Okay. They are happy the way XY is working under the direction of company A. They are absolutely happy because their wealth is also increasing, right? If XY's value is increasing, automatically the investments made by company B and company C respectively, these are increasing as well. So what happens exactly in these meetings, be it a board meeting where there is a representation of all these shareholders, or a shareholder meeting where they themselves are present through their representatives, what happens in that, A would decide something, right, in terms of, let's say, the budget allocation, the resources, the forecasting about the business, right, in terms of, let's say, the investment in the new set of equipments, etc. These are all decision making which are, for example, proposed by company A, right? But it doesn't have a majority. But importantly, whatever is proposed by company A, which is in the best interest of the growth of company XY, okay, company B and company C always agree to that. Okay. Which suggests what? Which suggests that probably B and C, right, are not interested in the operations of XY, but are keen to seek returns on their investments, right, in XY. So what they do is they simply follow what is suggested, right? They are more of a passive investor rather than getting into the operational decision making. Okay, that's the way you start distinguishing between how do you look at the investments, for example, as made by A versus B and C both, right? So what are we trying to build here is that, of course, all these companies have the voting power, right? All these three shareholders have the voting power as far as XY's operations are concerned. All these companies have exposure to the returns. Whatever is, for example, earned by XY, all these shareholders, A will get 45%, B will get 35%, C will get, of course, 20%. So they all have exposure to these returns. But essentially, the only shareholder, which is company A, is able to use that power to impact or influence these returns. Amongst all the shareholders, it's only A who's able to demonstrate that that is the company, that is the shareholder who's able to, let's say, operate the business the way it is meant to be operated. B and C are more investors, not exactly actively participating. Okay, which suggests that it's a very simplistic scenario, which suggests that company A has control, right? So how much, for example, now it's an important discussion, how much does A control over XY? How much does A control over XY? We say the control is all about controlling the business, and you don't control partially, right? So the control is absolute, the control is complete, 100%. Of course, the ownership is 45%, right? The decision making about the business of XY, the decision making about the assets of XY, the decision making with respect to the liabilities of XY, the 100% authority stays with A, right? It's a share of profit or share of returns, which is 45%. Okay. So what we want to bring here in this conversation, importantly, is that when you control everything, right? You control 100%. Unless it's a joint control. And when you see joint control, that falls under a different accounting standard. But Ind As 110 is all about when you control everything, and importantly, when you control or whatever you control, you consolidate. Okay. So in this scenario, for example, A becomes the parent entity because it controls. And since it controls, it also consolidate all the assets, liabilities, revenue, expenses, but of course the profit share is divided amongst the three players. Okay, so we'll be discussing that in consolidation procedure. The bigger focus is on the word control here, right? So what we say, control is where you have the power and the exposure to returns, and you are having that ability to use the power to influence those returns, right? Your examination may not be looking at testing your knowledge on what is meant by control, but you should know that in and out. You should know it very, very comfortably, right? As you discuss, consolidated financial statements. The examination would further with suggesting you whenever there's a question to do consolidation, those indications are always available, which suggests that which of the shareholders controls, which of the entity is the parent entity. So that would not be difficult from an examination standpoint. But yes, as a concept, we should be very, very comfortable understanding what exactly is the meaning of that. Okay, let's have a look at it. We say, and that's what it is, a control is nothing else but where the investor has the power. Well, of course, in the previous example, we said everybody had the power. And then we said it's an exposure to variable returns. It could be profits, it could be dividends, it could be, let's say, share of the value, etc. Again, in the previous example, all the three shareholders had that. But essentially, the one who controls is somebody who has the ability to use the power to affect those returns. Okay, and that is where consolidation has to happen. That's where consolidation takes place. Okay, but in case there is no identified, there's no absolute clarity on who controls, then probably the parent subsidiary relationship would not exist. That's where we say where no single investor has a control, then you need to evaluate whether it brings in joint arrangements accounting or it brings in investment of investment in associates accounting, or does simply the financial instruments accounting apply. Okay, we'll be discussing this both Ind As 111 and Ind As 28 separately. Financial instruments is something that we have already discussed. Okay, so the investor needs to consider all the facts and circumstances. This would also, by the way, apply to SPVs, special purpose vehicles, or special purpose entities. There could be some structured entities, again, not very relevant from an examination standpoint, but in general, you should be knowing this term, that there could be some complex arrangements wherein you create a specialized entity, or a separate vehicle, right? They would also be falling within the gamut of a subsidiary for consolidation purposes there. Okay, so formally defining the word control is something that we want to do here, is that control exists when the investor has the power, exposure to returns, and ability to use the power to affect those returns, right? There can only be, importantly, under a parent subsidiary relationship, there can only be one entity having control. To call somebody as a parent, to call someone as a parent, control has to be there. It has to be an absolute control, not a shared or a joint control. Okay, so when you again look at this definition, we say power would be, for example, somebody who has a ability to direct those relevant activities which might arise from voting rights. Okay, right to appoint the management of the company, and the voting rights may not be present right away. These could also be potential voting rights, maybe through share warrants, maybe through options, maybe through conversion features, etc. Right? Somebody who has a decision to make who has a right to make decisions as far as the, under the contractual arrangements, right? Or somebody who has the power to, let's say, throw the management off. Okay, so that is something that you want to build up as a broader coverage or an understanding of the meaning of the word power. Okay, similarly on the returns, we say that, do you have an exposure to those variable returns in form of dividends or remuneration, or do you see some kind of proprietary knowledge or synergies or cost savings or economies of scale, etc.? I mean, the very key purpose, we talked about goodwill. You would recollect under Ind As 103. We said that, why would you pay a premium to acquire a business? Because you see some synergy benefits, because you see some economies of scale, because of a cost saving opportunity. You bring those as a function or as a means of returns. That's what it is basically all about. And finally, the key question is that somebody who has the ability to use this power to impact or change these returns is the one who is the parent company having control. Okay, that's something which is, this entire conversation would reflect to, and need to be very comfortable about it. Okay, so you need to understand the entire purpose and design of the entity in which you are making an investment. And of course, you have to continuously assess. You keep on looking at it, whether the control still exists or it does not exist, right? It could be a little typical in real life, because people may not want to consolidate. Always remember, people may not want to consolidate, because by doing consolidation, the intra-group transactions can get eliminated, right? So they create, interesting ways to not call somebody a subsidiary, while in reality, it would be meeting the definition of a subsidiary. You still control that, right? So in case the word control comes in picture, you have to consolidate, right? The day you obtain control is the day you start doing consolidation, right? Remember, the date of acquisition, that is the day you start having the control. You see the interrelationship between Ind As 110 and Ind As 103. Every point in time, you would start understanding why probably these standards have to be understood or read together. Okay, so that's something you start observing it as a part of the definition of control. Let's have a look at a small example. It says that Sky Limited, for example, invests or has made an investment in Star Limited. It says that Sky owns 16% shares with voting rights of Star Limited, but then Sky Limited also has entered into an agreement with other shareholders through which it controls Star Limited. Now, interestingly, what is happening? Even with 16%, you have the control. Okay, even though there is a 16% ownership rights that you have got, you control the other entity, which means you consolidate 100% of the assets, liabilities, revenue, and expenses, because you are able to take the decision with respect to all these elements of the company, right? So you have the control and you shall consolidate. Okay, you are only eligible for 16% of the money, or the share or the profit, for example, or the reserves for that matter, right? Other comprehensive income, when I say that, right? But you still control and you consolidate it 100%. Okay, how about the remaining 84%? Because you have 16%, somebody else in totality have 84%. That 84% is referred to as a non-controlling interest. Okay, that is something that you might just want to remember. We'll be discussing that and do a lot of calculations. It becomes a bit more clearer in terms of how do we split the profits, for example, between the two sides. But you just want to keep it in mind. The one who the one who controls is the one who consolidates. How much? 100%, irrespective of shareholding. All right. This section is basically talking about the substantive rights, as in when we say that, you're talking about the power, the voting rights, right, and the ability to use that power to, influence those returns. We assume, as we said, that more than 50% would normally give the powers, and it may be the case that it is not always available with you. Okay, so need to be understanding that to have the substantive rights, to have that substantive or in substance those rights available, these should be exercisable, or at least, right, those powers should be available with you when the time of decision making is due. Okay, put it very simply, if I say I have an option, let's say I have 45% shares in an entity and an option to buy another 35% shares immediately, and the option is in the money, right? It's in my favor to have those shares to be purchased immediately because the pricing is fairly low. Well, in a way, these rights are substantial, even though I only have 45% shares at this point in time with me, right? So that additional 35% would eventually make it 80%. That gives me the right to take a decision about the other business with a majority shareholder, right? So that's broadly the perspective that you want to just understand, that even with the 45%, which is currently available with you, which are your actual rights, right? And an option of buying another 35% shares, and it is likely that the option can be exercised very comfortably, okay, because the option is in the money, right? So that's where you start looking at somebody with a 45% stake also is controlling the other business. Okay. Now, importantly, there could be instances, for example, an entity may have, protective rights. Protective rights simply means that, you're present there in the board, but your role is primarily to protect the interests, right? It could be, for example, a company where, which has nominated some people as a part of the board, and those people are merely overlooking the overall functioning of the business. Okay, so their rights are indeed protective in nature. They are there to ensure that, the rights available by the parent are not misused. Okay, the decision making is done in the best interest of the group. Okay, so when you say looking at power, the power is not available if your rights are merely protective. Okay, right? So for example, you may simply prohibit a decision making which can considerably increase the riskiness of the business itself. Okay, that's where you start looking at a typical example of a protective right. Okay, it could also be, for example, let's say you are borrowing too much of money to invest into some, some long-term assets, or for that matter, even approving the capex, which is significantly higher than probably the capacity of the business itself. So in those cases, the rights which are available to you, and you are able to obviously, take a decision about these aspects. You can probably say no to these decisions, but as more of a, protecting your rights or the rights of the shareholders in general. Okay, so effectively, your role is to more ensure that the business continues, but you're not involved in the generic decision making. And effectively, you do not have the control. Other party may still have the control in all these parameters. Okay, let's have a look at a smaller example around it. It says that there's a XY and there's a PQ. So let's say there are shareholders of Good Limited. Each of the parties have 50% voting rights, and let's say XY has rights with respect to the contractual arrangements, directing all relevant activities, making decision on capex, finance, and operations. Now the other party, PQ, has also the following rights, which is about veto rights over all the activities of the other business. So essentially, while XY is able to take a decision with respect to all these things, right? Effectively, PQ with the veto right would be able to override the decision making of whatever is decided by XY, right? While XY appears to have the power, but with the veto rights, PQ is having all the decision making rights. So whatever XY decides can be, sidelined by virtue of the fact that PQ has the veto right or the, overriding power available to itself, which means what? The control lies with PQ and not with XY. Okay. And since control lies with PQ, PQ is considered to be the parent, and therefore consolidation will be done by PQ, right? So good limited will be consolidated by PQ. That's how you start bringing all these aspects in reality. All right. Let's have a look at another scenario. We'll talk about what is the right that you have got in reality. What is the de facto right that you have got? Okay. Could be instances where specifically you say an investors with more than 50% rights has an ability through the voting to, let's say, decision making, with respect to the decision making for all the, relevant activities. And then, with respect to the decisions done at the shareholder meetings, or for that matter, you look at, of course, the board meetings as well, right? Now, effectively, till the time these rights are substantive, that's how you start looking at, bringing these, controlling ability available to itself, right? But then, in case, for example, an investor has more than half of the voting rights, if the relevant directors, relevant activities, for example, are subject to, an external approval, maybe there could be a government intervention or a court or an administrator or a regulator coming into the picture. So even if you have more than 50% voting rights, you may not be presumed to be the parent company or having the control there, right? Again, as we said before, somebody who's having less than the 50% voting rights may still have the control, may still have the power. Okay. So all those aspects need to be understood, established to be able to, for example, let's say, evaluate or confirm as to who controls and accordingly consolidates. Okay. You need to consider all aspects, all aspects, including the contractual arrangement with other shareholders, what are the rights available, what are the voting rights of, for example, the investors, etc., and also the potential voting rights, right? Importantly, if it is not or it cannot be established who has the power, then the control does not really come. Then the consolidation would not probably happen. Okay, so those facts and circumstances all need to be understood in entirety to be able to establish as to who controls, right? So it could be instances, for example, with respect to the contractual arrangement. We talked about that scenario of A, B, and C. While there's no formal agreement between A, B, and C, where we said that B and C simply follow what A is doing. But realistically, it could also be an arrangement, right? Wherein, for example, A holds 45% and another shareholder, which is B, that is simply, following what A is saying. There's an arrangement that other shareholder has got with A, and that shareholder has 25% voting right. So effectively, the decision-making power is applicable to the extent of 70%, which is available with A. Okay, so that's where A can direct, and accordingly, A shall, A controls and A shall consolidate. The voting rights of A are still 45%, but it still consolidates because, as per the arrangement with some of the shareholders, it has a majority stake there. Okay. Similarly, the rights specified under the, the contractual arrangement may allow, for example, the key processes of the other business, which you are managing or controlling. So effectively, those contractual rights would allow you to have, for example, a decision making authority. Similarly, you start looking at the voting rights, absolute amount, etc., the number of voting, the votes that need to be available, the voting patterns, and the previous shareholders meetings. Somebody who is attending those meetings but is always silent is unlikely to have the control, right? It also gives some kind of weightage with respect to the potential voting rights as well. That's what we want to briefly talk about here. Okay, it says that, importantly, potential voting rights are the rights arising likely with some conversion taking place in future, right? They would only be considered if there are substantive. For example, the factors you need to take care of: whether the exercise price is favorable in the money, do you have sufficient funding, what is the timing or the length of the exercise period, etc., would be critical in assessing whether these substantive rights can be, the potential voting rights can be converted into actual voting rights, right? And then what is the objective of having that instrument in place? What are the other investors' involvements? What is the expectation or the motive? What is the objective of even getting into the arrangement? Could be a critical scenario, right? It's a little theoretical, but need to be a bit more comfortable with the concepts there. Broadly, you believe where you see that the exercise prize money is absolutely out of the money. It's something which is not affordable, which is purely going with some very some terms which are not favorable, right? Or probably the holder has no financial ability, for example, to exercise the option, or if the exercise period is not there for a significant period of time, right? Then those rights are presumably non-substantive. But on the extreme side of it, if those exercise price are in the money, the holder has a cash or money available, and the rights are currently, or the exercise period is there, so somebody has a right to exercise those options. That's where these potential voting rights are presumed to be substantive. But the middle path is difficult, right? So if they're not deeply but out of the money, but the holder has to raise funding and exercisable before the decision making can be done, then you look at more information to be able to conclude whether somebody has sufficient control, sufficient rights to be able to establish the control part of it. Okay, let's have a look at this small example here. It should be able to clarify whether the potential voting rights are substantive in nature or not. It says that A holds 70% of the voting rights, B has 30%, as well as an option to acquire half of A's voting rights, right? So half of A would make 30 plus 35, which is of course 65, and the remaining stake would be 35 with A. It says the option is exercisable for the next 2 years at a fixed price that is deeply out of the money and is likely so for the next 2 years. And then A has been exercising his votes and actively directing the relevant activities of the investing. Now, what does it signify? Okay, firstly, we see A has the power, right? It has exposure to returns and is able to use the power as well. Okay, of course, B also has the power and of course the exposure to the returns. The option is there, but since the option is deeply out of the money, it is likely that those potential voting rights are not substantive. Okay, had it been in the money, right, or the rights exercisable immediately or the near future, it could have been a different argument. But given these facts, A is likely to meet the power and the control criteria. while B has the exercisable options, but since these are deeply out of the money, which is of course a barrier in itself, and accordingly these may not be considered as substantive. Okay, accordingly we say that A has the power and thereby control, and thereby will consolidate the other entity. Okay, let's have a look at this scenario. It says that A and two other investors each hold 1/3 of the voting power. So it's 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3. Okay. The investee's business is closely related to investor A. In addition to the equity instruments, A also holds debt instrument convertible into ordinary shares at any time, which is out of money but not deeply out of money. If this conversion takes place, A would hold 60% of the voting rights. Now, in this case, you would see it's a little more open scenario. It's not very clearly established, right? There are potential voting rights available with A, but we cannot be 100% sure of whether these rights would be substantive or not. So you start looking at, well, the business of the entity is closely related to the A's business, and well, the option is out of the money nonetheless, but not deeply out of the money. So probably, if A sees this as a factor that the investee's business is closely related, so there could be a synergy likely to happen, or could be an economies of scale, etc. And it would make every sense, even though it is out of the money, it would make every sense for A to exercise the option. Okay, likely A is going to do that, and accordingly it can be presumed that those potential voting rights are substantive in nature, right? That's what we're saying, that A would benefit from realizing synergies if these debt instruments were converted into ordinary shares. Effectively, you are going to control the other company with the 60% stake. And you will do that because you see some synergies as the business is closely related, right? So effectively, we may say A will have the power because it holds the voting rights and the potential voting rights, which are substantive, to give it the ability to direct the relevant activities there. Okay. Now, this is the other scenario. We are provided that Mars is in the business of developing AI-based products. It has acquired 45% rights in Venus, with a further option to purchase another 55%. Venus specializes in development of latest technology, and this was a primary reason for Mars to invest in Venus. Right? The key management personnel of Mars holds the balance 55%, and the key management personnel are a part of flagship project that will launch a new product. Now, in case Mars exercises its option to acquire the balance 55%, the KMP shall leave the company, and they carry, by the way, unique technological know-how, to, for example, let's say, run the business. Now, the question is, when you look at the exercise price, it says the 4 times the value of Venus Limited's share price. Okay. Now, effectively, what you observe here is that the two parameters. One is, in case Mars exercises the option, then the KMP would not stay. They were holding that remaining 55%. So they may not see a key reason to, for example, discontinue with that part. And at the same time, the exercise price being 4 times, it's deeply out of the money, which probably suggests that, right, Mars Limited would not be able to achieve any economic benefit as the price is way too high, and there is a likely loss of the key management personnel who are critical as far as the flagship project is concerned. Okay. So just to kind of conclude it here, we will talk about know the meaning of the word control. There has to be a power, there has to be an exposure to returns, and somebody with an ability to use the power to affect those returns, right? Again, We talked about the types of powers or the rights. They have to be substantive. Protective rights do not give you anything, right? But then for substantive, you also need to take into consideration de facto control and also potential voting rights. All right. Thank you very much.